This is my father. This is my mother. Both were born in Russia. My father came here in this country when he was 14 years old. Came by himself and worked his way across the country. And one of the things we found out later in life is when he couldn't speak English and someone asked him, he could sense that someone was asking him a question when he was trying to get a job, and he would say yes.
We don't talk about it.
To every job. He worked in farms, he worked on fishing boats, and he worked in Alaska in the copper mines. My mother came here when she was about 10 years old, and she lived with her brother and her mother and sister. Sister Frida is buried here. And
what was their maiden name?
Well, originally it was Mitnick, but it became Miller.
Here's an interesting one. It says, beloved husband Maurice Wynne, born Weinstein. That's an interesting change of names.
It probably was important to him to note from whence he sprang. But that's an interesting one, too.
Names were changed for so many reasons.
Yeah.
Many of them were changed as they came to Ellis Island, and the whoever was reporting their name couldn't understand, and so they were given names. But on the other hand, a lot of people did change their names to what they felt would be to better accommodate to the new country and to be more accepted into culture of the United States.
Right.
I think every one of us can tell a story somehow of how we acquired our names. But over there was my grandmother, who passed away in 1932. It shows her name as Anna Tushinsky. When they came to the United States, their name was Threeshinsky, and they shortened it to Tushinsky from Threeshinsky. That's a true story.
My grandfather Oscar had quite a story. He was a trumpeter in the Tsar's army, and one night he and 13 other fellow musicians swam across the river. This is the story. 2 were shot, and he made it to the across to the border, and he came to Portland and then sent for his wife, my grandmother Anna Kirshner, and she came with Ora and my father, who was, I believe, around 9 months old. On that journey across the ocean, my father did get sick. She kept him under her skirt.
There was a man whose last name was Fuchs, and he came from the same community called Chartres.
That's right.
And he settled in Montana. And he had a hardware, used junk shop, whatever it may be. And he and his wife, they had no children, and they were burned to the ground one night by anti-Semitic people who were there in the community. And they came to Portland, Oregon. And when he came to Portland, Oregon, he ended up sending for the oldest son of his oldest sister. And that was Rosenfeld.
Oh.
And then he sent for the oldest son of his second oldest sister, and that was Schnitzer. And then he sent for the oldest son of his his youngest sister, and that was Director. Yeah. And he brought all 3 of these to Portland, Oregon, and they still talk, and there's some pictures around of Uncle Fuchs, who brought them all to Portland, Oregon.
Oh, that's right. It is.
This is my great-grandfather, and he was born in Fluss, Bavaria, as you can see, and he was the 2nd president of Temple Beth Israel, and his wife, Adelaide, and these are their children. And some of them have dates, but most of them don't. I did know Viola, who was a great gal, and Bertha was a neat gal, and Bessie was sort of loopy but sweet, and Flora was not as nice as she could be. We We do think that Mose had some children, but he did not marry, according to the family story, he did not marry a Jewish gal.
But they were married.
But they were married, but we never heard about the children because my grandmother, great-grandmother, and grandfather were very, very strict and on lots of things, in fact. So I guess he hid it from them. Oh. And in those days, you know, well, maybe you don't, but things were very strict.
There was a lot of intermarriage, and the first, the oldest of the sons, married a Catholic woman, and he was, they ostracized him.
They did?
They did.
Yeah,
And
I
it
know. I
was-
had a member of our family who was like, that's it,
Yeah,
goodbye, don't
Yeah.
check in.
yeah, exactly.
One of my uncles had married a Catholic woman, and he made her promise that he would not, they would not know, the children shouldn't know he was Jewish. And I've had contact with one of his sons who said they would go to Mass every Sunday, and Dad would stay home to make a special breakfast. And they would say, you know, his mother would say, pray for Dad. And they'd say, he's a wonderful man, why do we need to pray for him? But on the way home from his funeral, their mother dropped the bomb that you need to know. And what they didn't know was about the other 5 uncles and the aunt that they had. He never told them about the family.
But it's interesting to see the very old tombstones,
tombstones are
are
different.
still in Hebrew.
Yeah.
That's when they
Well,
were engraved in Hebrew as well as English.
Look at my great grandmother's was not.
No.
Isn't that strange?
Well, are those
Well,
No.
1892.
1892 and they're 18?
Oh, is it Hebrew in the back? Thank you.
Well, it's like
It's Hebrew in the back. That's
A
good.
native of Russia. It's all
Yeah, they put that in
Like
because it's so
native of-
unusual.
a
It's so
native
unusual.
of Russia.
Yeah.
I've never seen that on a tombstone.
Well, I guess they were
before. That was
very
important.
proud that they got to be buried here because it was unusual because they probably wouldn't even let them in. I don't know.
A native.
What do you say, let 'em
What
in? What do you
Let
mean?
them in the congregation. They
Yeah.
wouldn't have joined the congregation because they were
Membership was restricted.
restricted in those days.
It was restricted to German Jews?
Yeah.
That's right.
In those days. So I don't know. Really don't know the story. My grandma never told me about that.
She didn't tell them till later that she came from Russia.
They knew. I'm sure she talked Russian.
Okay, well, here we are at the gravesite of my parents, Aaron Matza and Julia Matza. I guess they're kind of the quintessential story of immigrants. My mother came from the island of Rhodes, joined the Sephardic community here in 1939, and she came here to join her sister, Rachel Cordova, and her brother-in-law, Isaac Cordova, who sponsored her to come over just before the war started. And in those days, you had to have a sponsor. My father met my mother at the Jewish Community Center during the war. He was on leave from Fort Lewis and came down to a Jewish Community Center dance, and I guess that's kind of what happened to a lot of marriages then in the war years. My father was from Yanina, Greece. He was born there as a child and then went to New York City with his family in 1919 and then came out this way for the war. My father actually is not Sephardic. He's a Romanite Jew, which is a Jew from the Roman period, the ones that were expelled from the Holy Land when the Romans came, and they were taken as slaves. And on the way back to Rome, some of those slave ships crashed, and the Romans were beneficent enough to let the slaves go in those circumstances, and so they went up into the hills of Greece, and his village of Yanina, Greece, is full of what they call Romanite Jews, Jews from the Roman period, and they don't speak Ladino. They had their own Greek customs and their own Greek language for Jewish occasions. So my mother spoke Ladino, my father didn't, but when they argued, they could use all the Greek swear words.
This is my Aunt Lena. She was born in Russia, the first of 5 children. She never she was the only one in the family who had no college, but she was very well, she was self-educated, and she, I think her role was to take care of her parents who could not speak English and had a hard time navigating the American way of life.
I always say that the Yiddish language is a bastard language because wherever the people went, they picked up parts of the language. And because they originally had Hebrew in their background, some of the words are still Hebraic.
And the lettering is Hebrew letters.
All Yiddish is written in Hebrew letters, but phonetically. But those that went to Spain and Portugal and so forth, they took on Ladino, which is a bastard Spanish language. And those that went further north, went into Germany, they picked up a lot of the German language. And as they went up farther north, they took up Russian. And so there is Russian and German and Hebrew and Yiddish all into what we call Yiddish. But of course that was the tongue with which I grew up, so that's what I know.
Did your parents speak Yiddish to each other?
My father spoke Yiddish to my mother. We spoke Yiddish to my mother, but we always spoke English to my father. And because my mother wanted us to know Yiddish, and so that was her way. And in fact, she said to me when I was a child, "You speak to me in Yiddish and I'll answer you in English, and that way we'll both learn." And after I got to be an adult and had the nerve, I said to her, "Mama, which one of us is the smarter? I learned Yiddish, you still don't speak English." But she got by perfectly.
Well, when I was a kid growing up, my parents all spoke English to each other. And so I heard only English, but somehow out there were people speaking Yiddish, and I somehow picked it up. But my parents would be telling a story, and if it was a story that was a little bit on the risky side, all of a sudden my mother or my father would say, "Negavarit pamainka."
Oh, that's Russian.
Which meant, that was Russian, which meant the little one is listening, and they immediately went to Russian so that we wouldn't understand what they were saying.
Sure.
That most of us grew up during the Depression when there wasn't very much for anybody. But in those days, we didn't lock our doors, we didn't lock our windows, there was no drugs,
And none of us
and people
considered-
helped each other.
That's right. None of us
Whether they were
considered
related
us
or not.
poor.
If they came from the same town in Europe, they were family. So the extended family became very, very large.
There are the two oldest boys, Sam over here and Max, and they were actually responsible for the family being in Portland. That's what I always heard. They told the story that they were 7 and 8 years old and in a tenement in New York, and the father was away working and the mother was home with the new babies. And one day the father came home and found them in the basement shooting craps with some other kids. And he said, "That is not the way I want to raise my children." And at the time, there was a society or some group that got people out of New York and into the rest of the country, a Jewish society, who helped them. And my father-in-law went there, and they said, "Where would you like to go?" And he is supposed to have said, "As far away from New York as possible." and they said, "Portland, Oregon." And they got the help to be put on a train, and the whole family came here.
This is the grave of Sarah Zuckerman. She died when she was only 18 years old. It's a very sad story. She was born in Sonora, California, in the Gold Rush area in 1860. The family moved up here. They came to Oregon. At the time, that was the standard way to come, by boat over to San Francisco, up to Portland on boat, and then down the Willamette on river boats that live in Albany. And she died 1878.
Here is Benjamin Deutsch. He was not a member of Havarad. Benjamin had pioneered the introduction of pastrami into the United States, and we all cheered that because it was a wonderful thing. I mean, what would we do without pastrami?
My parents probably were here earliest, coming to Portland in 1909 and settling in South Portland, where all of the immigrants from Europe, from Eastern Europe, seemed to come, that came to Portland. All of us, the four of us, grew up in a neighborhood that we could consider almost as a self-imposed ghetto, where we would come freely, leave, come back, always were most comfortable in our own environment. And we grew up, I would say, all of us within 10 blocks of one another. But there was no home in the entire community that we couldn't go up and be welcomed into the house, and in case of any trouble of any kind, there was no door that was ever closed to us.
I want to mention about Old South Portland. We all went, all of us went to Shack grade school.
Yes.
And when it was a Jewish holiday,
yes,
the school was kind of half
empty.
empty.
Was half empty.
Yes.
Yeah. I decided not to go to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah when I was about 11 or 12 years old. I remember I was in the 6th grade.
Yeah.
And I argued with my mother, I don't want to go to the synagogue. I'm not going no matter what's happened. She says, all right, then go to school. So I went to school that day. None of my friends were there. The school was half empty.
Yeah.
I never, and I felt alone, you know, I felt individual. So I never did that again. But Shattuck School was 50% Jewish, yeah.
Yes.
We had a softball team in South Portland, and they were our sponsor. And we all had to furnish our own T-shirts, and they furnished the stencil. So with the stencil on our back, I'll never forget, we went out to Creston Park. It was the first time many of us has been out in the east side. And we came out there with a sign, and we were afraid we were getting a big fight with the guys out there because we had Lincoln Kosher Market on our back. And there was a fair amount of anti-Semitism at that time. But that was our first sponsor.
And everybody knew everything about everyone.
Woe be if you
didn't do anything wrong.
You didn't dare
if
do
you
anything
did something wrong,
It was a different environment.
within an hour, your parents would know about it, and you'd never hear the end of it.
Even though we grew up during the Depression, where money was scarce, I was out selling papers when I was 8 years old and saved enough money to buy my mother a refrigerator. We had an icebox. But anyway, we didn't have time, like Jerry says, to get in trouble because of family relations and what have you. But it was a different environment, We were poor, but I don't think any of us knew that we were really poor.
Nobody else had any more than we had.
That's right.
We were never poor. We didn't have any money, but we weren't poor.
And we were never hungry.
But by the way,
there was always someplace we could get something.
There were a lot of Italians who lived in the neighborhood too, and they were all dear friends.
This is Albert and Esther Schulhaus. Esther was my cousin. Albert, of course, was married to her. Albert was known as Slim, and he had the grocery store originally on 30th and Stark Street. Then he took over his father-in-law?
His father-in-law's.
His father-in-law's grocery store, which was on First Avenue between Hooker and Meade. He was very tall. I was 6'2", and he stood, I would say, another 5 inches taller than I was.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he went to the Meade Street Shill for years and stood out above everybody else. But he was always a very dedicated member of the Meade Street.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of the family. But Esther had sisters, and they're buried here also.
And Albert was a Holocaust refugee.
Oh, I did not know that.
I think he had come from Germany along the way.
He did.
That's my understanding.
And he had the number on his arm.
Oh.
I didn't know that.
I didn't either. I never knew that.
Or defined him in the way he looked at life and who he was. And it's kind of moving that it says, "We who loved Israel," because I remember it meant a lot to him.
Here we are at the graves of our great aunt and uncle, Abraham and Dora Lichgarn. And the reason that we're living in Portland, Oregon today, they had founded what was then Oregon Sign Company. They came out to paint signs for what was then the World's Fair.
Oh, really?
The World's Fair, and then they needed a lot of sign painters, so our grandparents came out from the Bronx in New York and moved to Portland, Oregon in
Was that the early Lewis and Clark
yeah.
exhibition in the early 1900s?
Yeah, that's what they
1903,
came
4,
for.
5?
Yeah, that's what they came for.
Abraham Lichgarn and Dora had 9 children. And we heard stories as children about, obviously their household was bedlam all the time.
Chaotic.
And they had probably 5 kids sleeping in one bed. And fortunately for our mother, because her sibs and mother moved to California, she had these 9 wonderful cousins. And they came from Rohatyn. We always were told that it was Austria, and at that time it probably was part of the Austro-Hungary Empire. But in fact, it's really today on the map as Galicia. But they were very proud of the fact that they were Viennese, because that was considered pretty elegant.
I knew your dad quite well because of the Ava Sholem. That's where I went to Sunday school. I still have pictures of you at graduation, confirmation. So, but I always knew your father as a pillar of the community, and he was a great man. So.
Well, this was a really wonderful. I was very blessed to have a mother and dad that I had.
But see, I knew your sisters a little better than you did.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Well,
we used to.
One of my sisters was 8 years older, so
yeah, I knew
so
her.
they
but
were gone you can understand when I started grammar school, she was already in high school.
Yeah.
That was a ways away, but they were all 3 wonderful girls.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Jane and Sue died very young.
Yeah.
Both of them were.
Sue was more my age, I think, and I knew her and used to
That's
see
right,
her
'cause she was just
a fair amount.
two and a half years older
Yeah.
than me. And she was little, the other girls were taller.
Well, those were the days when everybody used to go down to the Jewish Community Center, and we'd all get together, and all the guys and the gals, and we'd go to dances or whatever there was going on. And so
we went there to play basketball. I was a couple years behind you.
Yeah.
We went down there and played it.
You weren't as good as I was.
That's not what he told me.
Is that
Well, you know how that goes.
This is the gravestone of my late husband, Herb Ashkenazi. Herb was born in Vienna, Austria, and came to the United States at the invitation, or not say the invitation, of a man called Hitler. He was very active, and the synagogue was very important for him. And I can remember, because he was here a couple of months commuting to Wisconsin, and he called me up one day, and this is a direct quote, "They have a shul here." He said, "They have a shul. It's a real building, you know." And he was all, we didn't have a rabbi, but we had a shul, and it was, and I still remember the excitement in his voice. Herb became very involved in the Jewish community, and apparently as well with matters relating to the cemetery, which I was not aware of.
I don't know if you even know. When he worked in Albany, they lived in Salem, where there was a little bit bigger, or much bigger Jewish community. But Herb, on his own, driving by, noticed or took it upon himself to notice. And when at that time there wasn't much maintenance at all, he out of his own pocket, and I knew this because I used to visit, or still try to visit at least once a month to see what's going on. I'm local, essentially sexton, historian of the cemetery. He would hire people to mow, and come. Sometimes I would be here. He'd be throwing branches into the, cleaning up. He did a lot,
I had no idea.
and just he didn't want people to know. he just did it on his own. If he needed to pay, he thank God you guys had money and he could write a check for whatever needed doing. He just did it without wanting to get any credit or glory for it. He was just a caring person and cared about the Jewish community a lot.
My father was a manager of the Bedell store, which was one of 26 stores in the United States. And during the Depression, 25 of them closed, and the only one left was the one in Portland, Oregon. So my father became the manager. And he used to go on buying trips to New York, at which time my mother was there as a young woman, and they met. And when they finally decided to get married, my mother had never been west. Many Eastern people, young people in those days, in the early 20s, never came out of their own little roots. So when my mother came out to join my father in marriage, they were married by Jonah Wise in Portland. My father had a great idea. Here is this Eastern lady who'd never been west, never out of the state of New York. So he got his friends together, and they arrived. When my mother arrived by train at the Union Station, my father's friends, who had dressed up as cowboys and Indians.
Oh my gosh.
They met Ethel Osborne at the train station, the Union Station. Can you imagine? This lady, she was then a lady, she was all dressed up with these gorgeous hats and beautiful clothes. She gets off the train, and there are these Indians on horseback, no less.
And I never thought that we would move because we had a very comfortable life, and Don was very conservative, and I never thought that he would want us to pack up and move all the way out to Oregon. All my friends said Oregon, and they thought it was the Wild West. And as we took the journey across the country, I cried all the way from Chicago to North Dakota. But we came out here and we started a business, and he was so happy here. I think it was the happiest time of his life.
It took me almost 10 years to acclimate myself to Salem. Salem is the state capital, and it's a little weird, okay? You know, the motto of Oregon is "We're weird." Well, Salem is even weirder.
That's Portland.
Oh, that's Portland.
That's Portland.
Okay. And I grew up and was born in New York City, okay, in the Bronx. So as I said, this was the smallest place. Somebody once asked me, or I asked them actually, what was the population of Oregon? And they gave me, I don't know what number, and I said, that's about how many people lived in my apartment building.
I love a story about Harry, Uncle Harry, who, although he wasn't my uncle, that's what everybody called him. He had a shoe shine store, shoe repair store, as you said, in Skid Row. And when the bums came in, which was very, very often, asking for money, he would say, I'm not going to give you any money, but I'll buy you lunch. Because he knew where the money was going to go. And it was always very moving to me that he never lost that feeling of justice and of rightness, that I'm not going to give you that, but if you're hungry, I'll feed you.
Yes.
We both were pretty much together, and our kids learned that it was important to give to your community.
And how many kids did you have?
7 kids.
Wow.
Every Friday, Gussie would have to wake up at like 5 o'clock in the morning because her mother had made baskets for people who might be indigent or need help, to have charity. And that Gussie was supposed to go in the dark of night and drop these gifts of food or candles or whatever on people's doorsteps, and challah and possibly some wine. And Gussie always thought it was a surprise, and your mother always
your grandmother always thought it was a surprise, but most of the people that lived in the neighborhood knew very well where this wealth of gift and keeping food to sustain people came from, especially on Shabbat.
I can remember growing up, and Hannah Robeson was a legend in my family. My mother used to tell stories about her mother, who would go with Mrs. Robeson, and they would knock on doors of Jewish families and say, there are people who need help. Do you have any little bit of money? And she had a purse, and she would collect money and go from place to place, houses that they knew.
We lived on the corner of 5th and Lincoln Street. We had 3 houses on the corner of 5th and Lincoln. And on 4th, between Lincoln and Grant Street, was a woman by the name of Hannah Robinson, who later changed the name to Robison.
No, her sons changed it.
Her son changed it, and then she changed it. That's right. Well, he was in Ohio. And Mrs. Robinson, every Friday morning, would leave her house with 2 shopping bags. And in her 2 shopping bags was some food. And she'd go to the house next door, and people either put food in or took food out. And then she'd go to the next house, and the next house, and the next house, and the next house. She went all the way around our block every Friday morning, and people either put in food or took out food, and nobody knew whether you were putting in or taking out.
The old people's home moved from 3rd and College out to southwest boundary. The family gave a good deal of money in her name, and it became the Robeson home.
And this is Stu Albert, who we all remember very well. He had this amazing head of white hair and was a dynamic force in the congregation from the day he and Judy joined. Stuart was the 8th member, he used to tell us, of the Chicago 7, because Stu always took stands, and he sometimes took stands that were not popular in this community, but he stood by his convictions, and he motivated us, and he inspired us.
Well, Margie, is there a song that might be particularly good at this point?
Sure, there's the song from the 23rd Psalm. It goes like this. Kam ki elech begetz al mavet lo 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 irara lo 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 irara ki atai madi
She died in 1892.
And she came the year before?
Year before, And that's what my grandma said. A man, a doctor, told my grandma, she was a little girl, that if my grandma would die when the leaves fell. So grandma used to go outside every morning and pick up the leaves.
So she wouldn't see the fallen leaves.
So she wouldn't die.
That's nice.
But anyway, one of the best things about Julia Adler is her great-granddaughter, me.
What is interesting about the Stones is you would think that my mother's, comment, beloved daughter of Israel, is pretty generic, right? And you see it on a lot of gravestones. My father was a punster. And her father's name, my mother's father's name, was Israel. So my father put a pun on my mother's stone. And this story was told just in January when my grandson was born, who is named after my father. And the point, we think, was maybe that even, when we come to the cemetery and we're very emotional and all those memories rise to the surface, the inscription puts a smile on our face.
Here's my mother-in-law, Goldie Chesler, better known to the whole community as Grandma Goldie. She was such a character. She was a hilarious person. She loved her family most of all, and she told jokes, and she had sayings that we still talk about. We still laugh every day, practically, with Grandma Goldie's stories.
And my mother used to make flowers. Do you remember the flowers she used to make?
Sure.
She used to make them for everybody's wedding and bar mitzvahs and parties, engagements. And nobody had, all the florist shops in Portland went out of business because she made all those flowers. Nobody bought from her.
If you had the Sobels as a friend, you couldn't wish for any better.
Oh, thank you.
Because they were just wonderful people and a wonderful part of the community.
Yeah, they were nice people.
My mother's inscription says, "Loved you dearly while here, your loving mom and dad." And, and a friend of mine at the unveiling said, that was Flo. She always had the last word.
Rabbi Kleiman was coming, bringing my grandfather to my parents' house. And we lived on 33rd, and they were coming up 33rd and Broadway. And it said, no left turn onto 33rd. And my grandfather said, oh, you can do it. No, it says no left turn. And he said, no, you can do it. Adolf does it all the time. Well, they did it, and Rabbi Kleiman got a ticket. And he made my grandfather pay for it and never let him forget it.
By the time I had children, my parents and Nat's parents were both gone. So Mrs. Kleiman decided they needed grandparents' presents Hanukkah. And she would call me and say, Donna, you will bring the boys. They will light candles with the rabbi. And the rabbi was always said in capital letters. And my boys loved to go. She would always make a little party for them. There was always books to give them, and the rabbi would talk sports. It was wonderful.
These headstones are my very close family. Ignaz Loengart came to Oregon from Germany. When they came back to Portland, they came across the water in a big ship, and my mother used to tell me a funny story about somebody who she thought was quite obese, was walking ahead of her and her dad and tripped and fell. And it seems that this was not part of her figure. It was during Prohibition, and she was packed with bottles of liquor. And unfortunately, several of them broke. And she was lying there in a pool of liquor. Right, yes.
My mother's name was Rebecca Menashe.
She was something special. And I remember that she and my mother used to do a lot of things together. And my mother just adored her. She loved that woman. She was, I don't know.
One of the things I remember about my mother is that she wanted to become an American citizen, and I don't know, at the not the neighborhood house. Yeah, I guess it is a neighborhood house. They used to have classes there, and all the Menashe used to go there and learn how to be a citizen. And my mother, I saw pictures in the newspaper, the Oregonian, her with the governor, being introduced as a new citizen, and that's one thing I remember that she wanted to do. But she, like Sal says, she made up her own mind.
She was a
I remember
wonderful lady.
We bought a duplex in Old South Portland. My dad was not too sure about it. The guy who owned it was an Italian. He thought that when Italy lost the war, that was going to be the end of him, So he decided to sell it. My mother's, like $5,000 bought a duplex in those days.
These are my grandparents, Alex E. Miller and Sadie Wolf Miller. I never knew Alex. He was killed in an automobile accident on the way to a B'nai B'rith convention. The Millers were quite friendly with the Bergs, and it was my understanding that they bought these plots together and decided to make all their gravestones the same. And these gravestones are they're actual signatures. And I can tell you, those ones are right on because I've seen the signatures. And of course, the Charles F. Berg one we know is right on because that is what was used for the Charles F. Berg sign in the store.
Daniel was just the beloved child of Richard and Leah. Had 3 kids. Daniel was the youngest. And he went into a diabetic coma, lost his mind, died. And my grave used to be where that Mr. Spellman is. Okay, we already purchased. So Daniel's father comes down and says, you know, Daniel just died. We'd like him to be right by where we're going to be. I call the synagogue. They say, I'm sorry, but the grave diggers are already there. And I said, well, just move them. I mean, move the grave diggers over to this other plot. You know, we're just switching plots. You can't do that. Pouring down rain, I put on my boots with my shovel. I come up here. Sure enough, there's grave diggers digging this hole. And I say to them, fill that hole in. I have my shovel. And I start digging the other hole. And they look at me like I've lost my mind. Perhaps I had. And they run down and they get this guy. He comes running up. You can't do this. You can't do this. I said, we're just switching graves. We've already paid for these holes. I can give him my hole. I can take the other hole. With this whole la-la they call the synagogue. They come back and blah, blah. And I'm already digging the new grave. I'm digging and it's raining and I'm digging and I'm digging. And finally they come back and they say, okay, okay. So I fill in the other grave. We dig the new grave. The people are looking at me like I'm nuts. The next day, I come and the rabbi gives me such a look.
I see my wife's grave over on the side. It's quite a story. We were going together when I was in college for almost 3 years, and then we were going to get married in March of 1941, and around February, my wife and I my girlfriend and I decided to elope. Well, Rabbi Sidney, who was Ave Shalom's rabbi, said the only way I'll marry you is if you have a member of each of the family there. So Millie and I decided on a Thursday that we'd like to get married Saturday. Well, state law was very strict in those days. First, you had to have a 3-day waiting period. Second, you had to have a medical exam, which takes a week, and to get the license. So I went up to see my Uncle Simon and told him the problem. I said, we would like to have you there. And he gets a hold of a judge. I think the man's name was Judge Snow, a white-haired man. And Judge Snow we went to see him Saturday morning.
Berkeley Snow.
He called Dr. Himmelfarb and says, Doctor, I understand you are the doctor for these 2 kids. He said, yes. Are they okay? Yeah. He signed a waiver. Didn't need a medical. Now the 3-day waiting period. He says, well, that's no problem. He signed another waiver. I didn't need the waiting period. That night, we actually got married.
Here's my dad and my stepmother.
And her stepmother was my great aunt, my grandmother's sister.
Yeah. But when Dad met my stepmother, he had to go to Evelyn's father, Adolf Asher, to get permission to marry her.
And what do you think? How many years ago was that we're all standing right here discussing them?
Well, what's weird about it is that my father and Donna's father were good friends, and now we're best friends, and it just carries on.
It's wonderful going on. I love it.
My daughter and her son drove to high school for about 6 months. Hal drove Robin. They never talked.
It stopped there. Yeah, we had such good ideas. We were going to marry the 2 of them off, and it would be the wedding where the mothers high-fived each other.
Doesn't always happen that way.
There's something on his gravestone, DFTCO. Right. And everyone thought I was crazy to put that on there. But what it says is, don't forget to change your oil. That was Don's mantra.
Yeah.
And believe me, I haven't forgotten it.
I can add one more thing to that oil thing. I had a car at one time, and the engine blew. Why? Because I hadn't put any oil in it.
Okay.
So I I had committed the principal sin. So I promised him, and Dad, I have kept this promise. Since that time, I've always had my oil changed by somebody professional. I haven't deviated. I've still done it. You can relax. It's all good.
You have to go back further to Scheike and Ruchel Schnitzer. Here's a man who worked hard, who scraped and saved in order to build his fortune and future. And she was just the most simple, ordinary housewife who stayed at home, who cooked and baked and cared for her children. And even after they had amassed fortunes of money, it didn't change her a bit. She was still the same Ruchel Schnitzer she was when she lived on 5th and College, 5th and Jackson. It was right at the end of the street where there was no place else, in a little house. I don't know how they raised all those children there.
Anybody who went to Hebrew school in the 40s and 50s probably remembers Mr. Chernikowski, Chaim Chernikowski, white-haired gentleman with a very, very stern look on his face. And I have to say, as a kid, I was really intimidated by Mr. Chernikowski.
Oh, he was known to have a huge temper. And he
behaved or else.
And he didn't. He used it not sparingly.
That's true.
Mickey, I mean, this is just so amazing. I think she must have taught every kid in the city how to swim. And she was such a character, and you were saying she terrified a lot of them.
She was a tyrant. She terrified everybody.
Awful.
But they learned to swim.
They did all learn to swim. I mean,
she was a fixture at the Jewish Community Center for how many years? Plus all the wonderful things she did with Red Cross.
Yes.
With polio, when polio was so prevalent.
Yes.
She was. She worked with those polio patients. Yes, untold.
She was always in a bathing suit with
Never
a white cloth bathrobe.
But did you know she taught religious school?
Yes, I did know.
And she taught all these kids and terrorized them. But she
them.
also taught my father-in-law, who had never learned how to swim, and he did it secretly to surprise my mother-in-law when they went to Hawaii.
Oh, is that fun?
And when he finally got in the water and paddled around a little bit, my mother-in-law ignored it.
That was terrible. Well,
for all that effort of his and Mickey's.
I started with Mickey when I was a baby, and she loved me. So I was the exception. She didn't terrorize you. She didn't terrorize me.
Probably bobbed in the water.
And my sister Bobby, who was just a year older than I, and we stayed with Mickey for years, and she had us doing exhibition work for the Boy Scouts.
You were good swimmers. Their whole family.
Well, we were.
But
we
Mickey
were good
was
swimmers
because of Mickey.
Because of Mickey.
I remember Mickey was always in the pool at Jewish Community Center.
The old JCC downtown.
She started very young as a teacher, and she would come into the pool area with waders on. None of my contemporaries ever saw her swim. We don't know whether she knew how to swim.
Oh my.
But she was in waders. She was always in the pool teaching, and I was scared to death of her. She was so firm. I was frightened. She also became the director of B'nai B'rith camp when it was only for girls for the first sessions or for the boys. I don't know who, probably Polly was for the boys, but Mickey was the camp director.
I was the one, as the youngest, that swam Devil's Lake, and that was Mickey was in a boat next to me.
Oh, that's exciting. I mean, but that was a big thing. You got an award if you were able to swim across the lake.
Oh, yeah.
So that was a real big deal.
Well, Olga Prudensky, as I said, was a very lovely lady, but she was a character too. When she was in her 80s, she would play bridge, and I would drive her once in a while to the bridge, and I said, do the ladies play good bridge? I said, it's not the ladies, it's I play with the girls. And she just loved it.
It's very typical, though, for that generation to be known as the girls, because my mother, who also she grew up in New York, but she came here as a bride, they always referred themselves to the girls. The generation of young women today would rather be known as the ladies. You know, it's a different...
Or the women.
I remember your mother very well, Ethel Green and Albert. They were super people, but they all, as they got older, gave them the younger names. And that's what I do, because I'm still a little boy at 81.
All right.
The fondest memory is that Mrs. Wolf and her daughter Susan took us, when we were about 10 years old, to the first opera that I had ever seen, and it was Madama Butterfly. And it was such a powerful experience that it's how I grew to love the opera so much. And ultimately, I ended up being on the opera board a few years ago.
Oh, so here we have Anne and Lori, my two best friends, who both of them died too young. Anne was one of our leaders in Havara, and she did so much, and she was very, very involved with making sure that this cemetery lasted and thrived, and we were able to have plots for all our congregants and for people in the community. They were both such wonderful friends. And I come up here and visit them and say hello and let them know what's going on.
And Anne was the president of Havara.
She was.
And a gentle but strong leader.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
And she loved the cemetery. She was very, very involved in the cemetery, the growth of the cemetery, and making sure everything was just right up here.
But that's how she was completely. She loved everybody and everything, and she made it all wonderful and warm, and you just felt enveloped in her warm embrace.
Yes. There's lots of rocks here, and the beautiful painted rocks are from the grandchildren. And we're teaching them to come up here and to say hello and to respect and to treasure this beautiful cemetery that we have.
My own mother, who is buried across the way over there, used to say to me in her Yiddish tongue, "When I die, come and visit me. Speak to me. I will hear you, but I will not be able to answer you." And so I come all the time, as you can see by the number of stones on my parents' tomb, that I come and I do talk to them. And I feel no morbidity about coming here because it's so beautifully maintained and cared for.
But when we come out here, these people that you see, these stones, they're all alive to us. They really are, because we have so many wonderful memories.
There's no day in my life that I don't say, Mama said, my dad did, my dad said.
One of the first things that Judaism mandates is when you move into a community, the first thing that you should do is form a cemetery.
Right.
So that you have some place to put your people to rest.
Not many people know that, but it's true.
Yeah.
It always impressed me that as a young congregation, we made it a high value to have a cemetery, that we were going to take care of the needs of our community and be prepared.
That's true, because we were only 2 or 3 years old when we started looking, and it was not easy finding a cemetery that fit our needs.
And that was true that our priority was to have a cemetery when we weren't even thinking in those years about ever having a synagogue or an actual building of our own. But we were willing to have a cemetery of our own because we thought that was really important.
And I guess, if you think of it, if we as a synagogue do no longer exist, we've still got the cemetery here with a lasting memorial.
this is the marker for my parents, Esther and Oscar Overback. And when I come up to this part of the cemetery, I feel like I'm visiting everybody in my family. My brother, my other brother, sister-in-law, my sister, brother-in-law, my cousins, the Millers, Soretta and Maury Miller, the Weinsteins, Nora and Max Weinstein. I just feel like I'm coming home.
This whole little area is the Passover table. There's my mother and father, my grandparents, my uncles, the Shermans, the Lindenbergers. This is, so you imagine that there's somebody here with a baseball cap on, because they often wore that for the Passover. Baseball caps or yarmulkes seem to be the deal.
Well, as you walk around this cemetery and see the tombstones of a lot of wonderful people, I'm standing in front of one of my dearest friends, Al Weinstein. Got to know him when we were freshmen at the University of Oregon. Well, before that at Benaber's Camp, but actually he lived in Eugene, and we formed a lifelong friendship. I don't know that there's anyone here, and there's a lot of wonderful people, more respected or more beloved than Alan was. He had so many friends.
He was very well respected. And as a matter of fact, we've had some very large funerals out of Sheratora, probably 4 real large ones, and his was, the synagogue was packed up and down.
He had a great part of his anatomy, his right arm. It reached for a check faster than any guy I've ever seen in my life.
That's right.